right. Thank you so much, everyone who's coming in. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Thanks for being here. This is the first of 4 webinars that are a series. So if you have friends that missed this one, get them for the next one. Though we're also recording it, so people can still catch up. And my name's Tristan. I'm coming from Middle Tennessee, DSA, Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm going to give just a little bit of background on where you are today, where you found yourself, and then introduce our guest, and then hand over to Avi Chomsky to talk to us. Then we'll have a chance for questions, and then we will close. And so today, this is our first webinar, again, of a series of 4. That is coming out of a statement that DSA published just a few days ago. I'm going to give a little background, which is that we've been working on this statement and this series for a few months. And as you might imagine, it had to go through a bunch of iterations during that time because bullshit kept happening and we had to keep updating it. So for example, when we were initially preparing the statement and thinking about this series, we were thinking primarily about Greg Abbott in Texas and Operation Lone Star and the use of state felony charges to weaponize and corrupt and intensify immigration policing at the state level in Texas and all of the rhetoric that was building around it. And then we had to update things when then the Democrats, President Biden, issued an executive order in June declaring a shutdown of the border using rhetoric that was not unlike the rhetoric being used by Greg Abbott or by Donald Trump. Then obviously more updates. And so you can see the statement, I think it's about to hit the chat, that was put out just a few days ago that really puts us in the context of we are now between the anti-immigrant panic that was being expressed at the Republican convention in Milwaukee and the anti-immigrant sentiment that we are anticipating coming out of the Democratic convention in Chicago, which is where you see the statement kind of placing us. Unfortunately, we do not want to be here and we need to change it. And so that's where this came from. And we're understanding it. What we're basically doing in terms of an initiative is that as these conditions evolve and we're seeing the forms of anti-immigrant policing. So policing, not necessarily exclusion, but policing including repressive inclusion. This is to say, letting people into the country under oppressive and exploitative conditions. Essentially what we might understand, not as catch and release, but catch, terrorize, and release, or partially release. And we're seeing that on an international scale, right? And so we came up with this collaboration between the International Committee of DSA, the Abolition Working Group of DSA, the Immigrant Rights Working Group of DSA, and is going to be joining us soon, DSA Labor, as kind of a number of different commissions working on this collaboration together. So where that's headed, and you can see it in the statement, is we're going to talk today in general terms about what you might call border imperialism, you might call it anti-immigrant policy. Avi's going to give us a lot of new and old terms for it in kind of a big picture sense. And then at our webinar in 2 weeks, on August 29th, we're going to be joined by Marcela of Detention Watch Network to dig in specifically to the campaigns against migrant incarceration in the United States particularly, though it's of course a transnational process. And then 2 weeks after that, we're going to move to some allies on the Mexican side of the border, Mexican activists that are part of the Colectivo de Monitoreo, who have been doing accompaniment with migrants in Mexico, where more immigrant exclusion and policing is occurring even than on the US border. And so we're going to be joined 2 weeks later on September 12th by Margarita Nunez from the Colectivo de Monitoreo. And then 2 weeks after that, we're still planning out all the details, so stay tuned, but we'll be talking specifically about, okay, as working class people in a number of countries, across a number of borders, how do we undo the processes of division that are the ultimate goal of these border imperialist policies, and how do we fight back by organizing ourselves as working class people across those divisions that are imposed on us. So that's where we're headed. And now I'm going to introduce Avi, who's here with us today. Avi Chomsky, you can drop some love for her in the chat if you'd like. Sorry, we can't let you unmute to do it. But Avi Chomsky is a professor of history at Salem State and has written for years about domestic immigration politics, about labor movements and their interactions with immigration politics, but also particularly in this internationalist context that we're trying to build out in DSA as well. And drawing that context from her own extensive study and writing about revolutionary movements and class struggles in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, particularly in Colombia, Central America, in Cuba, and also their interactions with climate and environmental justice movements against extractive colonialism and extractive capitalism. If you haven't read anything by her recently, we're going to drop an article in the chat that just came out, I think, 8 days ago, that was printed on the, I believe it's called World Indigenous Peoples Day, and connecting the struggles against colonialism, the struggles against extractive and fossil fuel capitalism, and also implications in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, which I think, as everybody knows, is in part a struggle between two versions of indigenous land claims that are weaponized and are distorted in many ways that I think a lot of us would critique, but in ways that are important for us to understand as we stand in solidarity with indigenous movements across the region. And so something for you to chew on and read perhaps after the webinar. But now we're just going to go ahead and pass in a moment to Avi. If you have questions during this, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll be compiling those questions. We're going to give Avi about 30 minutes to walk us through and explore some of these issues, but we'll be compiling those questions. As feel free to drop them as they come up, or redrop them in about half an hour when we get to 7:40 Eastern time. And then we're going to have about 15 minutes of questions and answers and engagement. But for now, I'll go ahead and pass to you, Avi, to start walking us through it.
Thank you so much, Tristan. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. So yeah, I have a lot to say. I've tried to put it into a PowerPoint that I can show you in 30 minutes. We'll see if that, how well I do. I might end up talking really fast. Let's see. Okay. Solidarity across borders, understanding border imperialism. So I'm going to try to talk about 3 different topics in addressing this concept of border imperialism. One is the question of border imperialism and status, the different ways that migrants and would-be migrants are categorized and what kinds of rights they have, and the imperial aspect of that: refuge, asylum, parole, and more. Second, border imperialism and Democrats versus Republicans. And just picking up on what Tristan was just saying, obviously we have an election coming, and we have Democrats and Republicans kind of trying to outdo each other in their anti-immigrant rhetoric. So how do we understand this issue of Democrats versus Republicans? Are they the same or are they different? And finally, border imperialism and what is being presented to us as a border crisis on the front pages of the newspapers every day. So those are the 3 topics that I will try to go through rather quickly. First of all, the question of status and the ways that even as international law and domestic laws in the United States and elsewhere have tried to do away with questions of status, in the international sphere, in terms of countries, the question of status and of assigning different statuses and different legal rights to people based on these statuses remains really central. So that domestically, we aren't supposed to do that. Everyone is supposed to be equal, and the same laws are supposed to apply to everyone in the same ways. And we criticize countries that treat their citizens unequally under the law. And yet, at the international level, we completely accept this idea that people should be assigned statuses. And then when the international and the domestic coincide, that is, people who are not citizens are inside the country, the fact that they have different legal statuses is totally taken for granted and goes without saying. So just that very question of status, I wanted to call into question as an imperial concept. But I also wanted to specifically, because we use these words so much, just mention the difference between refugee and asylum law, which have something in common but are actually quite different, and then talk about the issue of political versus economic migrants, and again, the sort of imperial aspect to all of this. So refugee law applies to people who are outside of the United States and or whatever country they're going to be seeking refuge in. So the United States operates its refugee law by setting up numerical quotas of how many refugees it will accept each year. And these refugees are vetted extensively, chosen and vetted extensively in their home countries or wherever they may be. It's a process that can take years, even over a decade, before a person is actually approved, and different family members may be treated differently. It's an extraordinarily complex and bureaucratic system. A lot of it works through UN agencies in different countries to decide who has the right to be a refugee and who doesn't. I mean, there's written rules, but when it comes to actually implementing them, it's a complete mess. The United States accepts a very small number of refugees, internationally speaking. Most refugees are refugees in poor countries that actually do not have the resources to provide housing and food and anything else to refugees. But people who are granted refugee status, when they finally do arrive in the United States, there is a federal system set up in conjunction with non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, to in a sort of rational way, send people to places where there is housing available, where there is jobs available, where there are organizations that are committed to help people during their first year as a refugee in the United States to gain access to services. So that is one legal structure of system of structures. Asylum is also based on the idea of people who fit into certain categories being eligible for asylum, but asylum is granted after a person either reaches the border or is already in the United States. And it's also an extraordinarily complex legal process with a lot of rules and regulations, and most people who want it don't get it. But if a person is granted asylum, the only thing they get is the right to remain in the United States. They do not get all of the social services and support that people who are granted refuge get. Underlying this assignation of status is the question of what the United States defines both legally and in the popular sphere, in the media, as political versus economic migrants. That is, only people who are fleeing their countries for political reasons due to different kinds of repression by the government because of their belonging to a group are eligible for refugee or asylum status. And yet the way the United States defines political versus, and all other migrants are sort of dismissed as they're only economic migrants. They're not really fleeing repression, so they don't have the right to remain in the United States. And that is something both in the law and in the popular discourse that we hear so much. However, it's really important to point out that under capitalism, economic suffering is defined as economic and not a reason to flee. Whereas under socialism or communism, economic suffering is defined as political. So that when the economy is collapsing under capitalism, it's never political. It's not the fault of capitalism. It's just, well, we don't really know why, but we don't talk about why. But if economic suffering is occurring under socialism or communism or any alternative to capitalism, it's political. It's the fault of the government. It's because the repressive government. So the question of political versus economic is extremely politicized itself. And for more information about just how utterly ridiculous both systems of refugee law and practice and asylum law and practice are, I really recommend these two books that I list here. Maybe somebody wants to drop them in the chat as well. Jessica Goudot's book, After the Last Border, Two Families and the Story of Refuge in America, and Siobhan McKirk and Adrienne Pine's Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Asylum Industry. So Democrats versus Republicans, I think no matter how politically astute we are, we still somehow have the idea that Democrats are less anti-immigrant than Republicans are. And I'm going to emphasize here just how similar they are. And one area that I just wanted to begin with is this idea of criminalization, that immigrants are somehow criminalized in the popular imagination. And both Democrats and Republicans promote this narrative. So I have Obama. Over the past 6 years, deportations of criminals are up 80%. And that's why we're going to keep focusing enforcement resources on actual threats to our security. Felons, not families. Criminals, not children. Gang members, not a mom who's working hard to provide for her kids. The vast majority of people who are deported as criminals are people who have actually committed civil violations of immigration law, not committed the kinds of crimes that you think of as having to do with security. But this whole language of criminalization and security, felons, not families. Do felons not have families? That Democrats, even supposedly liberal Democrats like Obama, have just promoted so strongly. And then, but part of the problem that I want you to think about is that when a Democrat is in power, it's so much more difficult to mobilize opposition to their hardline immigration policies. So when Donald Trump says something like, we have some bad hombres out there and we're going to get them out, referring to Mexicans, you know, if you look in the mainstream media, there's this huge outcry, oh, Trump is so racist, he says all these terrible things. But when Joe Biden says, referring to the Chinese, when bad folks have problems, they do bad things, there's not a whisper in the mainstream media. And I think we saw this under Trump, that it was much easier to mobilize popular opposition to Trump's policies than it has been to mobilize opposition to Obama or Biden's policies, even when they're pretty much the same policies and pretty much the same rationales. So when Biden was elected, has the Biden-Harris administration made anything better for immigrants? There were a few small changes, like ending the Muslim ban, changing the family separation and detention of children to allow unaccompanied minors to enter the United States, which is actually simply abiding by the Flores settlement of 1997, that is the federal government is legally obligated to grant certain rights to child migrants that Biden restored. Biden certainly talked more nicely, despite his comments about bad people doing bad things. Biden said that he wanted to address the root causes of migration, which he identified as poverty, violence, and corruption. I'll talk more about that later. And most recently in June, and this is again a very small technical change, but streamlined the path to legal permanent residency for undocumented spouses and children of US citizens. So this is actually quite a parallel to what Barack Obama did in his towards the end of his second administration in 2012, when he created DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And it really fits the criminalization narrative too, that, oh, well, there's a few good immigrants, so we want to help them, but obviously most immigrants are bad hombres. What's not better for immigrants? This is a very long slide, so I try to divide it into categories. One of the most draconian policies by Donald Trump was Title 42, which basically ended asylum. That is, nobody arriving at the border was allowed to request asylum in the United States. And Biden actually kept that in place until May of 2023 and expelled more people than Donald Trump did using Title 42. And shortly after ending it, imposed the enforcement side of his June 2024 executive orders, which basically did the same thing as Title 42, except instead of using public health as a rationale, it used numbers as a rationale, so that basically prohibiting asylum claims when the numbers of migrants reaching the border gets too high. So that's one category in which I don't see a lot of difference. A second category is this idea of addressing the root causes of migration. If we go all the way back to President Bush with Plan Mérida, Obama with the Programa Frontera Sur, and then Biden's Alliance for Prosperity, that is saying we're going to tackle the root causes of migration, but doing it through a set of policies of like pouring money into security, which is militarization of borders, and what they call prosperity, which is basically fostering foreign investment, which, as anybody who's studied the history of immigration knows, that foreign investment very frequently serves as a spur to out-migration. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if we want. Militarization not only of Mexico's southern border and the interior of Mexico, but also Guatemala's southern border and the interior of Guatemala, and even the southern border of Honduras. So a lot of this so-called aid is going to militarization and immigration control, outsourcing of immigration control. But also, what Biden forgot to ask is, what are the root causes of poverty, violence, and corruption? Those things may be part of the causes of migration, but what are the causes of poverty, violence, and corruption? And I think that's where the question of empire is really central. And I probably don't have to explain that to any of you, but again, we can talk about it in the Q&A. What is Kamala Harris's position on immigration? Well, we don't really know, because she hasn't come out with any firm policy statements, except the one of do not come in June of 2021 on her first visit to Guatemala. But what we have heard her saying in general terms is really that she's trying to attack Trump from the right on immigration, and saying that Trump didn't know how to control the border, but I'm going to know because I'm a strong woman. And I tackle tough problems like militarization of the border. What's worse for immigrants? Aside from some of the specifics, this is looking at more of the actual causes. Playing xenophobia, playing up the China threat, anti-Asian racism, xenophobic nationalism, and potential war. Xenophobia is bad for immigrants. Refusal to block vaccine, intellectual property, and patent rights, a jobs recovery plan premised on America First style nationalism, increasing fossil fuel production, use, and infrastructure, despite the Inflation Reduction Act and investments, which also have a strong xenophobic and anti-Chinese thrust to them. In clean energy, there's also been increases in fossil fuel production, use, and infrastructure. and sponsoring Israel's genocide and in Gaza. So a lot of the colonial mind frame underlies Biden's policies, and that is bad for immigrants, and it's also bad for the countries that immigrants are coming from. Differences between Democrats and Republicans. This takes us back to 1993, and looks at different ways that immigrants have been expelled. Removals, which are from the interior, returns, which are people who are turned away at the border. And when we call Obama the deporter in chief and look at the deportation rates under Obama, we're really talking about these interior removals, the buildup of the interior infrastructure. But removals did not increase greatly. Neither removals nor returns increased greatly under Trump. And the Title 42 expulsions increased greatly under Biden. So for all this sort of populist rhetoric of, I'm going to be strong on immigration, I'm going to be strong on immigration, there's other factors that really play more into how many people are removed from the United States, both at the border and from the interior. Border imperialism. So, okay, that's the section on Democrats and Republicans. Finally, what is the crisis and what can we do about it? This is the last section. Wow, I'm talking fast enough. I think I'm going to make it through. So we hear a lot about the crisis at the border, and I would, of course, argue that the crisis, the specific border aspect of the crisis, is a crisis 100% created by the United States. But that the real crisis is not at the border. It is both in the countries that people are coming from, in the countries that people are passing through, and inside the United States. That is, it's a really multifaceted crisis. And asking us to look at the crisis at the border is asking us to look for solutions in terms of securitization and militarization. Something interesting has happened in the last year or two, which has been the sense that there's a migrant crisis in US cities. And Boston is certainly one of the cities that is suddenly talking a lot about the migrant crisis. For a long time, the Democrats in power have been very happy to leave the migrant crisis, that is the crisis of the people who are entering the United States, at the border. And when Republican governors in the border states started doing things like saying, wait a minute, you're telling us we have to let all these people in, but you're not giving us any resources. So how about all those northern cities that claim they love immigrants so much doing their part? The Biden administration and the liberal media and the northern cities said, no, 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 those Republicans are so evil. They think we should have migrants here. They should be the ones to deal with it, not us. So the way this has been turned into a partisan issue, and it's interesting to note that when refugees are allowed into the United States, there is an infrastructure set up, and the federal government has played a big role in contracting with cities to be refugee resettlement centers and helping cities, contracting with nonprofit organizations. But that in the current so-called migrant crisis, people are being shipped or coming to cities in a completely chaotic manner, with the federal government saying, yes, we're going to let all these people in, but we're not going to do anything to set up a system for once people are inside the country. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I did want to talk for just briefly about settler colonialism, immigration, and how immigration became a crisis at all. And again, I'll have to go over this really fast, but we can come back to it in the questions. The United States, of course, as a settler colonial country, as all settler colonial countries, is based on the logic of eliminating the native population and replacing it with a white settler colonial population. So every settler colonial country, and I include Israel among these, has, and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, is based on the idea that citizens are the white people who come into the country, and the non-white people who we're colonizing have no rights in the new country that we are founding. So immigration was fostered, state-sponsored white immigration, both in Latin America and in the United States throughout the 19th century. And it wasn't really until citizenship laws were de-racialized and immigration in the late 19th century with the creation of citizenship by birth. And then immigration laws were de-racialized in the late 20th century that people started talking about the immigration crisis. And when citizenship was first de-racialized, it was de-racialized only in terms of citizenship by birth. That is, anybody, regardless of race, could be a citizen after the Civil War. And that is when Congress started saying, wait a minute, then we can't have all of these non-white people coming in because they're all going to become citizens, and that would destroy the racial character of the country. So the extent to which the idea of an immigration crisis has its history in racial exclusivity is really important to keep in mind. And finally, the question of why are immigrants coming and what can the United States do? Overwhelmingly, immigrants are coming from countries where the United States has been really deeply involved in creating crisis situations that people are now fleeing. And this is also true globally, that immigrants are in Europe are coming from former European colonies. So that the colonial powers that created the crises also set up the structures where people fleeing the crises, the logical place for them to go is the place where those crises were created, whether it's France or Britain or the United States. But what could the US do? Oh, before that, so is there a crisis? Certainly the numbers of people at the border is increasing. Not higher than it's ever been before, although there was the year of 2023, it did go a little bit above where it was in the year 2000. But, it's been a constant up and down with a sort of a lull and then a rise, especially after COVID, which put a damper. So there was a sort of a built up pressure of immigration. Another thing to note about the current so-called crisis, and when I wrote my Central America book just a couple of years ago, we were always talking about the Central American migrant crisis. And it's really not a Central American migrant crisis right now. If this is something really striking that has changed and also helps to explain why it's a so-called crisis right now, is that it was somewhere around 2010, 2011 that Mexican migration started to reverse, so that more Mexicans were leaving the United States than were entering. There were still large numbers of Mexicans entering, but there were more Mexicans leaving. And Mexicans, who had historically been by far the largest group from Latin America, started to be overtaken by Central Americans. So looking at the proportion of migrants that of encounters at the border, of people coming from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, even as late as 2020, 2021, those 4 countries accounted for by far the largest proportion of migrants, close to 90%, close to 80%. And that shifted between 2022 and 2023, so that Mexicans and Central Americans together are no longer the majority of people coming to the border. And that also really helps to explain why suddenly are we experiencing this supposed crisis in our cities, because Mexicans and Central Americans with a long history of migration almost always are coming to established communities where they have a place to go. They have people to get them on their feet, relatives, friends, cousins, to give them housing, to help them find a job, often under extremely exploitative conditions, to force them to work for them under extremely exploitative conditions. But people coming from countries that do not have these established communities are the ones that are creating what cities like Boston are seeing as a crisis. Share of total encounters, by nationality. Mexicans are still the largest single group reaching the border. Although we don't hear about the Mexican migrant crisis at all now, we hear a lot more about Venezuelans, who are a much smaller number than Mexicans. And then these much smaller numbers coming from the small countries of Central America, which again, we don't hear that much about in terms of the crisis, but we do hear particularly about Haitians, even though there's such a tiny number of encounters compared to some of these others. So there's reasons why certain migrants are perceived as a crisis much more than others. Another reason is Biden's parole program, and this is which includes Haitians and Venezuelans, where far fewer, if any, are being sent back to their countries. So much larger numbers are being allowed to enter the United States legally, but without any kind of support. Just to give a quick picture of all of these different things, this is from the previous fiscal year ending in September 2023. We don't have figures for this fiscal year yet, but large numbers are still entering undetected, estimated a little over 500,000, but 2.5 million encounters by US Customs and Border Protection. What happens to these? Again, this was mostly before Title 42 was ended. Many were expelled under Title 42, but large numbers were processed and allowed into the United States and are still in ongoing legal proceedings. Crisis in the cities. Oh no, I'm not going to finish in time, but I only have one more slide after this. Just to mention that the housing crisis predated the migrant crisis. So large numbers of migrants are going to cities that were already suffering housing crises, like New York, Boston. Shifts in the origins of migrants, I already mentioned, shifts in federal policy that bring migrants into the system, but without the kinds of supports that refugees are given. Federal failure to update, coordinate, and fund the system. What could the US do? This is the last slide. We really need to be thinking in very different kinds of terms than the ones that any of our politicians are talking about. If we really wanted to attack the root causes of migration, we would look at empire. We would end the sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela. We would reform the trade rules that create poverty in countries of Latin America and elsewhere in the world, especially the investor-state dispute settlement system, dumping of subsidized US products like corn on Mexico, thus dispossessing Mexican and Central American corn farmers. Debt jubilee, almost all of the migrants are coming from heavily indebted countries, which means that their governments are unable to direct resources to meeting the needs of their own populations. We could open the border if we wanted to end the migrant crisis. We could end the crisis on the border by opening the border. And instead of expending huge amounts of resources on militarizing the border, expend those resources on actually creating a system to help migrants. Legalize work and raise the minimum wage. The most effective form of foreign aid and the largest form of actual foreign aid to heavily indebted countries is remittances. So if workers in the United States could earn more money, they're the ones who are actually bringing about effective economic development in their own countries. And fossil fuel use, because increasingly migrants are climate migrants. There are rural people who are forced out of their lands because of climate change, climate loss and damages, and finally halt military aid to Israel. I just had to have that one in there, and that's the end. I didn't go
Thank
over too
you.
much of that.
No, you're perfect. And thank you so much, Avi. And it feels almost silly at this stage that we tried to limit you down to 30 minutes and that we are committed to ending on the hour. But it does allow us, hopefully, to leave a little bit of a cliffhanger for our next webinars. Everyone, I'm going to pitch really quick. Join our group, which you can do. If you're a DSA member, which a lot of y'all are, you can go into the chat and you'll see the registration for the next webinars. But on that same Action Network page, you'll be able to fill out the sign-up form that allows you to join our group and keep this work going. Situation we find ourselves in as DSA is we are preparing for some pretty rough scenarios that are already occurring, as Avi's been talking about, but could intensify in 2025. And so we're trying to prepare for the international dimensions that are increasingly where a lot of that crisis is occurring. So that's my pitch. Please join the group. But now you can go ahead and drop questions in the chat. Obviously, we already have enough questions to fill our last 15 minutes, but go ahead and drop them. Maybe yours will take the spot of an existing question. And go ahead if you'd like and turn your cameras on. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pass the questions as the facilitator, but go ahead and turn your cameras on if you'd like to. Let Avi see us and our beautiful faces. So just to give people a minute to process their thoughts and go ahead and drop questions if you'd like to. They're getting passed to me in a Google Doc right now. I'm going to go ahead and ask this question that has come up already a couple of times, which is, if you can talk a little bit about, this is combining a couple of questions. There's questions coming up about Cuba, about Venezuela, about the statistic that was just dropped in the chat is that perhaps as many as a third of the nations on Earth are facing some form of US sanctions. And the ways that those nations are being, how the populations coming from each nation are maybe different from each other, how those have been evolving, and then the legal regime that is applying kind of uniquely now, that they're offering work permits to people of a certain nation, but not another nation, and that are coming from countries with very particular punitive US policies towards them. If you could just kind of respond to that reality that we're now in, and maybe even, this is an add-on if you'd like it, some of the class composition or the differences in how those populations and those flows of populations have been changing during this time.
So obviously the US sanctions on Cuba are some of the longest standing sanctions. And the United States, the decisions about who gets sanctions imposed on them is, of course, extremely political. And what we see in Latin America and really globally is that a lot of times sanctions are imposed by countries that economically try to pose an alternative that is threatening to US profits. And they really have very, very little to do with anything like human rights or anything like that. And I mean, if you just look at the ludicrous nature of sanctions being imposed on Cuba and not on Israel, given what's going on in the world right now, I mean, I do think that there are circumstances like genocide, where international pressure in the form of sanctions, or like apartheid in South Africa, where international pressure in the form of sanctions can actually pressure. Well, I mean, in the case of Israel, without huge influxes of constant US aid, they wouldn't be able to be carrying out this genocide. So, this very direct, but that's not the way the United States thinks about sanctions. The United States thinks about sanctions in terms of basically US corporate interests. And when those are threatened, let's make sure that no economic alternative to being subject to US corporate interests is allowed to exist in the world. And I think the sanctions on Cuba are the clearest example of that. Make the economy scream, as Kissinger said about Allende's Chile. I think it was the secretary, I can't remember which US official said about Cuba, if we allow the Cuban Revolution to succeed, other Latin American, and this is in my book, other Latin American countries are going to want to follow the same kind of nationalistic economic policies that are detrimental to US investors. So we have to decide if we want to let the Cuban Revolution succeed. And basically the same thing, the decision was to make the economy scream so that Cubans would overthrow their government. The class composition of Cuban migration has changed a lot over the course of the many decades of the Cuban Revolution and the US sanctions on Cuba and more violent attempts to overthrow the revolution as well. During the first decade or so, it was primarily the privileged classes whose economic interests were being threatened and who were leaving, and who, through this way that economic migrants are defined as political migrants when the United States doesn't like their government, were considered political migrants and granted automatic asylum, and not only asylum, but an array of benefits that was more similar to the way refugee law works. So Cubans were essentially automatically considered refugees and eligible for social services, for jobs, for housing, for all of these things. And a lot of them in Miami were actually employed by the CIA immediately upon arrival. So it was completely political. Over the decades, especially since the 1980s and the Mariel boat lift, the class composition and the race composition, because those two are almost inseparable in Cuba as they are everywhere in Latin America and in the United States, the race class composition of migrants has changed dramatically. And the politics of migrants have also changed. That is, the first generation of migrants, the 1960s migrants, tended to come to position themselves on the far, far right of US policy. And those are still the Cubans who control most of the money and most of the lobbying organizations, like the Cuban American National Foundation, that is the Cuban, basically the biggest Cuban lobbying organization that essentially sets US policy towards Cuba. So that the later generations have had a really difficult time establishing their own political voice in the United States. But they have tended to come with much more nuanced views of the Cuban Revolution. Many of them came for many of the same reasons that Salvadoran or Puerto Rican migrants came, not because they specifically rejected the politics of their country, but because survival is difficult and they wanted a better life. I'm talking a lot more about Cuba here than I am about Venezuela, because obviously I've done a lot more in-depth research and study and spent a lot more time in Cuba. So that's where I feel like I have more expertise. But in many ways, the Venezuela situation has a lot of parallels to the Cuba situation. But economic survival is extraordinarily difficult in both of those countries right now. And the main reason that people are fleeing is not because they don't like the government, it's because they want to survive.
Thank you so much, Avi. And we'll see if I pull this off. We're gonna try to move you through two more questions in
Okay.
6 minutes or so, and I'll do a little announcement at the end. But question one is about the border, and just kind of, you've already touched on this, I think, but just kind of giving you a chance to say a little more of, if it is true that the crises that are occurring are not not a border crisis, but rather crises of livelihood, crises of housing, crises of healthcare, crises of employment in countries of origin and our own, then why is the border so effective as a way to build political rhetoric? Why is the rhetoric about the border? And what should it be about?
So, I think there's so much fuzziness in mainstream political and media discussions of migrants. So, for example, most people who are undocumented in the United States actually did not cross the border without authorization. They entered the United States with visas and they overstayed their visas. And so they became undocumented after arriving legally in the United States. So if we're worried about people being in the US undocumented, well, abolishing status differences is one way to address that, right? If we believe that all people are created equal and have equal rights, then why are we assigning different statuses to people? But I feel like both parties have weaponized the border because it's a way of mobilizing nationalism and creating immigrants as a threat to national security. So bad people are going to cross the border, and so we have to protect ourselves by protecting the border. I feel like it's an effective political tactic because it has great emotional resonance. This in the same way that criminalization has great emotional resonance, but it's basically appealing to people's fears and trying to turn people's fears and animosity is kind of like pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. For those of you who grew up on The Wizard of Oz, turn people's animosities away from the actual problems facing our own society and finding a scapegoat to pin them on. And the border plays a big role in that there are all these bad people out there and they're trying to get in here and they're going to hurt you when they get in here.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to give you one more question. It's an impossible one to answer in the time you have, but it was unlike the others. And so I'm going to give it to you, which is about the H2 guest worker program. There's a question in the chat that, maybe for those who aren't familiar, this is a program originated for farm work, but for lots of non-agricultural labor as well, with maybe 500,000 people or so coming through a year currently on temporary visas. The question is, as we have both parties, both attempting to compete with each other on new restrictions of free migration, both are also making proposals for new forms of semi-free migration, which is to say the captive labor programs or the second tier status guest worker programs in which you have to keep a job in order to have rights. There's a question now of, should we be thinking about this? Is this a big threat? How does this fit into the larger border imperialist system?
Well, I would say that it fits very well into the settler colonial system, which is the settler colonial system has always relied on maintaining status differences and importing rightless workers, enslaved or otherwise, who can do the dirty work of society, a lot of which in the United States is agricultural work, but it's also has always been and is increasingly now different kinds of care work, cleaning and care work, and food processing and production, as well as direct agricultural work. In India, they were called untouchables. They weren't imported. They were a status was created for people inside the country. The predecessor to the H2 program was the Bracero program, which did exactly the same thing. The difference between previous programs and 20th century programs is that in the meantime, like people who were enslaved in Africa mostly came from subsistence societies where they were self-sufficient. Now, the United States empire has done so much to destroy subsistence societies elsewhere and the ability of people to support themselves elsewhere, that for many people, both the Bracero program and the H-2 programs seem to serve as a lifeline because it's a way to get into the United States and make some money. But that doesn't change the fact that it is creating an unequal system of statuses where workers are infinitely exploitable because they're infinitely replaceable because we're taking them from somewhere else and we are legally defining them as without rights.
Avi, you just ended that sentence on the dot of the hour, which was extraordinary and a testament to your many years explaining hard things well. I'm just in these last couple of minutes going to remind folks we have another webinar in 2 weeks, which is with Marcela Hernandez of Detention Watch Network, digging specifically into the use of the migrant incarceration system as one of these forms of pressure that keeps migrants terrorized and, I think as Avi's pointing out, cheaper as workers, right? And we'll be able to, you can register for that webinar at the link that just got dropped. And then we'll have another 2 weeks later about the externalization of this border imperialist system, or you might call it deputizing or twisting the arm of regional governments to do the dirty work for ICE. Because sometimes the Democrats, or less the Republicans, but both, sometimes the Democrats get embarrassed by doing it, despite their insistence that they're even better at it than the Republicans, and deputize others to do it out of sight. So we're going to talk about that in 4 weeks. And then in 6 weeks, come back to this question of labor organizing, the ways that the border imperialist system fractures working class alliances and relationships, and what we can do about it as labor. So those registrations are in there. We want to thank Avi so much for being here with us today in this absurdly short time and covering so much ground with us. Go ahead and give Avi all the love that you can. Avi, now you have permission to look at the chat if you would like.
Yeah, I was just actually starting to do that.
And please do invite your friends, get involved. We have, in either scenario that faces us in 2025, a lot of work to do. There are hundreds of organizations already doing that work who we can partner with, learn from, and build in support of. And that is our intention with this new collaboration, and excited to have as many people involved as are able. So you can see those registration links. Maybe we'll give people a couple of minutes to slowly fade out so that you have time to get into the chat and process and digest and get those links out of it. But we'll start to make our way out with a big thank you to Avi Chomsky. Avi, you want to say any last word?
No, I've had my last words. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks for all the nice comments in the chat. And please make sure you send me the link. I'll try to publicize this too if you're going to put it up somewhere.
Will do.